Now this English language A-level video is all about how and why language changes. So first of all, let's start thinking about changes from below or changes from above. So when we think about most normal language change, it is this process of change from above, i.e. it's not some institution which is forcing people to change their language style. It's usually driven by the users of a language. And usually it's appearing in some kind of vernacular forms, like some kind of slang forms. So think, for example, about changes in pronunciation, where in the last 30, 40 years, people have started changing their intonation patterns. So they're making statements with rising intonation at the end, so it sounds like they're asking a question, etc. Now that up talk that I've just done there, that's not the government saying, you must up talk. That's ordinary people who are doing this phenomenon in order to respond to some kind of social need. Okay, and similarly, when new words come into the language, take a word like staycation, for example. There's a good blended neologism, staycation. Again, it's the users of the language who are creating these. Maybe they're getting them out there on social media, and the word is disseminating really quickly. These are examples of language change from below. It's useful not to think so much of language changing, but instead people changing language. Okay, so think of human beings as the subject of the verb changing, and therefore it shows that, it's people who have agency over the language. Okay, so changes from above and internal factors. Well, let's have a think about changes from above. This is change which is initiated by people or institutions with some kind of dominant social position. They've got some kind of authority, instrumental or influential authority over people. And this is about encouraging people to use so-called standard or correct forms, which then become prestigious. Okay, so, and this may be all about standardization or simplification. Take this little book here. This is the London Simplified Spelling Society, April 1915, the pioneer of simplified spelling. And look at the way that they've done their spelling there. So this is an attempt to reform spelling by producing these sorts of books. So this is attempted change from above. Now we do say that language change is inherently natural, and actually deliberate attempts to trigger change or to stop change, they're often met with very deep resistance, and quite often they fail. Okay, we've talked in a previous video about politically correct language. Now there's a good example of the kind of debate that rages about, whether we should be using the word, mixed race rather than half caste, for example. So there has been limited success in terms of people or institutions from above trying to change language. I suppose that you could argue that historically in the 18th and 19th century, there were some very clear successes. When I'm thinking about the grammarians like Bishop Laud and Lindley Murray producing their grammar books in the 18th century, which of course were then used in schools. And so that was very much sort of change from above. And of course the lexicographers, Samuel Johnson with his dictionary in 1755, and then there's Noah Webster's American dictionary, which first came out in 1828. So those are notable examples of changes from above, where people are attempting to fix or standardize the language. Okay, now if we go back to the previous slide, often language changes, most of the time, language changes because of external factors. And when we're talking about external factors, we're talking about, colonization, invasion, conflict, and other sorts of social influences, things like developments in technology and medicine, shifts in social attitudes. Okay, so English language is a fascinating subject because it's a reflection of history and the lives of people who speak it. Deeply results from political, economic, social, and cultural factors. Okay, so these big social factors may have an influence on the way that we pronounce individual words, the kind of new lexis which is pouring into the lexicon of the language, or the way that grammatical structures are created. So let's just have a think about some of the big factors, the big social or historical factors which have influenced English, particularly British English, over the years. And we can, talk about things like the Norman invasion, the printing press, developments in navigation, the Renaissance period, the Industrial Revolution, developments in education. We've got the influence of the world wars in the 20th century. We've got advances in communication technology. We've got the rise of the USA as a global superpower. And we've got like post-war affluence, so growing wealth in the latter half of the 20th and early 21st century. And then we've got the latest technology. So what we'll do is we'll go through each of those and try and think, well, what specifically, what impact has that had on the language? So I would encourage you to pause the video there and have a ponder about how some of these social historical processes have impacted on the language of English. And think about different levels while you're doing this. So don't just think about words, also think about grammar, think about pronunciation. Let's kick off then with the invasion of England by the Stormen Normans in the 11th century. So there's William the Conqueror, 1066, bringing his mighty men across the Channel. And that's had a profound effect, hasn't it, on English language in lots of different ways. From a point of view of the lexis of the language, David Crystal estimates that something like 10,000 words come into English in the medieval period from Norman French. Now, that's a huge proportion. So the impact of the Norman French is seen in certain semantic fields, which become absolutely full of Norman French words. Words to do with costumes, for example, or the law, or administration, for example, to give you 3 examples. Okay, and what you get therefore is a kind of lexical layering, where you get more and more words being used in the language, and therefore you have, as an English user, you have greater choices in the kind of word that you use, which may be used to show certain nuances and connotations. Compare the 3 verbs, ask, question, and interrogate. There's ask, that's an old English word, a good old-fashioned monosyllabic neutral word, ask, and compare that with the connotations of the word question, which comes from Norman French. Somebody who questions you is somebody who has authority. Okay, it's the police who question you. It's the magistrate in court. It's your parents who question you. So they're people with authority. So that's kind of encoded in the word. So it's got a slight connotative difference from the Old English word ask. And then you've got that word interrogate. Guess where that comes from? Yes, Latin. Okay, the language of the church, ironically. So interrogating surely is questioning, but with threats of violence underlying as well. So extreme power. So this is a demonstration of lexical layering, how the new words that are coming into the language, and particularly in this Norman French time, give the speakers of English different nuances and connotations of expression. So we've got that thing happening. In terms of grammar, we've got lots of things happening on with second person pronouns. So we've got the thou, thee, and thy. But then on top of that, you've got the Norman French ye, you, and your. So in the Norman French period, then it's now possible to differentiate not only between a singular and a plural form of your pronoun, but also in order to show your relationship with the person that you're talking. Have you got a familiar relationship? Have you got a detached, reserved relationship? All of that is encoded in the use of those second-person pronouns. That comes from the Norman French. We've also got Norman French spelling conventions. So we've got good old English words like queen, for example, which in Old English is spelled C-W-E-N, and the Norman French come along and they think, right, we're going to use our Norman French scribing techniques here, Q-U-E-E-N. Okay, so one of the reasons why English spelling is somewhat inconsistent is because we've had Norman French scribing systems applied to English words. And then finally, in terms of accents, you've got slightly different intonation patterns, where the Norman French intonation patterns are putting them in slightly different places. Take a word like important, for example, important, so they're putting the stress on the second syllables. So those are all linguistic results of the invasion of England by the Norman French in the 11th century. Let's move on to the invention of the printing press in the late 1400s. Wow, what a beautiful cup of tea. So this is happening in 1476. This is a guy called William Caxton, isn't it, who has found this, seen this technology on the continent and thought, right, I want some of that. I can make a shed load of money from this. So he sets up the printing press on the grounds of Westminster Abbey in 1476. And for the first time, English is printed rather than handwritten. Now think of the effect of that, because what you're getting there is a growth in literacy, because more people are being exposed to the English written word. Therefore, there is an impetus for people to be learning to be reading and writing. And it's the beginnings, as we've seen in a previous video, of the move towards standardization. Because William Caxton is scratching his head thinking, well, what form of English are we going to use? Am I going to use Northumbrian English or Wessex English or Kentish English or Mercian English? Because there are all these mutually unintelligible dialects that are hanging around in the country, and people basically can't understand each other, as was demonstrated in the previous video when we talked about William Caxton's eggs. Okay, so he makes a choice. He makes a choice that, right, the East Midlands dialect is the one for me, because it's the one that's spoken in London, i.e. the seat of power, Oxford, Cambridge, and that rich agricultural belt that's kind of north of London. Okay, so it's kind of like the forerunner of British Standard English. We move on to developments in navigational technology, enabling Europeans to sail overseas in the 1500s. And of course, this isn't just people from these shores, it's people from across the whole of Europe. So what we're getting here is a lot of borrowing. So we've got vocabulary that are coming in from European languages as a result of people navigating across the world. So we get apricot from Portuguese, we have opera from Italy, we have mosquito from Spanish. So in the Renaissance period, which is when this is happening, we've got this huge growth in the lexicon as a result of loan words and borrowing. And not everybody likes it, of course. Remember, there was this writer called Thomas Wilson who wrote in The Art of Rhetoric that these are all inkhorn terms, i.e. these are false artificial terms. Why do we need all of these new words coming into the language when we can just use our good old-fashioned Old English word hoard rather than vocabulary? And not only did we borrow, I say we, the people of the Renaissance in the UK, not only they borrowed words, but also they borrowed some of the orthography, so some of the spelling patterns. Take that word mosquito. Why is it spelled Q-U-I like that? Well, it's taking the Spanish spelling pattern and applying it to English. Okay, thinking about the Renaissance then, so this is this time of enlightenment really, and really it goes hand in hand with the development of the printing press, because suddenly more people are able to read and write. And so there is this renewed interest in the classical disciplines, in science and art, and the old medieval truths are no longer just slavishly followed. So in this Renaissance period, we have a lot of these words that are introduced from Latin or Greek, or they are created from originally Latin and Greek roots. Words like encyclopedia, with its dodgy digraph in there. So you've got the vowel graphemes in there, which encode that this must have come from ancient Greek. And abstract nouns like expectation. So all of those words that end in T-I-O-N, like that, they all come from Latin. So we've got Latin and Greek root words piling into the language. We also have, because this is a Renaissance period, and suddenly you're getting some form of interest in what could be considered science, we have the debut of some scientific lexicon. Electricity, for example, which is first written in English in the 17th century, something like the 1630s. And then what you've got is spelling conventions which highlight these classical etymological roots. So you've got your academics who think, right, it's important to show that these words that we are speaking have a classical root. So they take an old English word like island, which was originally spelled I-L-A-N-D, and they think, haha, this comes from insula, the Latin word, therefore let's put an S in it. Okay, so you might be forgiven for thinking, oh, there's an S in the word island because it must have been pronounced. No, it was not pronounced. It's basically academics trying to showcase their knowledge of the etymological roots of these words. So then we've got the Industrial Revolution that's coming on. This is this development in technology and the growth of urbanization. So that's had a massive impact on language, doesn't it? I mean, first of all, you've got the development of certain vocabulary in certain semantic fields, like trains, for example, where you get huge numbers of new words and expressions that are being used. You get also at this time the emergence of the educated middle classes, because they're wanting to differentiate themselves from the workers, the poor workers. So they are taught prescriptive rules, and they have to learn these rules in order to show that they are ladies and gentlemen. They're a cut above, they're educated people, they're not part of the working plebs. And then you've got this huge migration of workers across the country, from rural areas to urban areas, and therefore you get the creation of these new urban dialects and accents. So you get Scouse and Glaswegian and Newcastle and all the rest of it. So the growth of these areas around the Industrial Revolution leads to these new distinctive accents and dialects. We have the Elementary Education Act, elementary, my dear, 1870. So this makes education compulsory for all 5 to 12-year-olds. I think this is the first of its kind in the world. This, of course, leads to rises in literacy. So more and more people are able to read and write, and it puts more and more emphasis upon standardization, because the reading and the writing that you're doing has to be of standard English. And so what this does is it increases the power of the literate over the illiterates working and the middle classes. Okay, so if you haven't been to school, then obviously you're at a disadvantage over other people who are well schooled and can read and write, and therefore can fulfill all sorts of career paths. We move into the 20th century, where we have war. What is it good for? So we've got your 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century. And I suppose this has been important for English because you've got this contact now with countries around the world, and it's been important in establishing English as a kind of dominant language. Think, for example, of the Second World War and what happens in Japan at the end of the Second World War, where there's lots of American troops in there, and therefore English becomes a kind of very prestigious language. And similarly in Central Europe, like cities like Berlin, for example, which is divided up into different sectors with an English or an allied sector in one of them. So English becomes important as a kind of dominant language. And also, as a result of the war, you get more lexicon that arrives into the language. You get expressions like over the top and basket case, both of which come from World War One, and it's the language of the trenches, over the top, going over the top, out of the trenches into the battle line, and basket case, so corpses being removed from the trenches. Okay, so then we've got developments in communication technology. I mean, think of the impact of things like radio and TV in the mid-20th century. So this, I mean, the BBC is established in 1922, and it really establishes BBC English, particularly marked RP, as the kind of dominant, important form of English. So if you're speaking that form, then you're speaking the correct form, the correct sound of the language. And of course, this is disseminated not just across this island, but across the world. This is the BBC World Service. So you've got all of that. And then, of course, you've got the influence of American culture. And that's really exported through cinema and music. Okay, so that's had a profound effect upon global English. And so this is, the emergence of America as a global superpower. If you want to think, why has English moved from being this very low status dialect that it was in the medieval times to this big superpower where, 1.5 billion people across the world speak it? There are 2 predominant reasons. One is about the colonization, about the British Empire. But the second one, and probably the most important thing, is American power. It's this development of America as a global superpower, because American English becomes the world standard English. And if you're learning English in other parts of the world, like Singapore or Korea, for example, then it's more likely that you're going to be learning to speak the American form of English. We tend to try to copy, societies which we perceive as being powerful socially, powerful historically, etc. And therefore, we're getting the spelling of things like American English spelling patterns as well, where, if you spell colour, C-O-L-O-U-R, i.e. with that British English digraph in the vowels, then you're going to get a fuzzy line under that if you're typing away. And that's encouraging you to be using the American English spelling patterns. So over time, you can see that accruing more and more, and the British English spelling form perhaps disappearing. And then, of course, you've got post-war affluence in the UK. So you've got more money that people have, not just the you know, the upper classes, but the middle classes and the lower middle classes, they have more money, and therefore they have more ability to travel. So they're more in contact with other cultures. You have things like package holidays, which really start off in the 1960s, I suppose, in the UK, where we get this growing lexicon of, you know, food and drink, for example, from different languages and cultures. People going for kebabs, for example, because they've been on a holiday to Turkey. And then you get people aspiring to speak the language of powerful groups. So people are going away, they're traveling, they go away on a holiday, and those tourist areas where they're going to, predominantly people are using English all of the time because it makes sense in terms of them developing their society. Okay, so English is seen as a kind of desirable language. And then sort of getting nearer to where we are now, we've got these incredible developments in communication technology. We've got the internet and mobile phones in the 1990s and going through into the 21st century. This has had so many different impacts. There's a lot of anxiety, of course, about it, and there's always people who are complaining about language change as a result of this, and they think there's a kind of degeneration that's happening. Standards are lowering, and particularly children are not being enabled to use standard English because they're too busy on their phones. What you would say is that there's grown a kind of informalization of the language. So although people are typing, you know, think of people WhatsApping, for example, or using language on Instagram, they're using kind of like conversational forms. So this is what you're getting now with technology, that you're getting this blended mode form of communication with lots of informal forms and lots of conversationalized forms as well. And that has sort of bled through into journalism as well. So journalism now has a lot more kind of conversational forms that maybe wouldn't have been in those particular publications, let's say 50 years ago. And because there is so much traffic in English on the web, that therefore consolidates English as the dominant cultural mode. Okay, so if you were in my group now, I'd be showing you this video. It's called Birth of a Nickname. It's well worth you catching that. It shows how a particular word like nickname is a result of processes, historical processes. Let's talk about the how language changes. This is getting a bit more conceptual here. So there is information here in the textbook on page 221 about random fluctuation and cultural transmission. We're going to show you some charts here. So we're in territory that we don't usually stumble into for English. Some linguists believe that the conventions of a language are learned by interacting with other users of the language, and that therefore it's kind of random and unpredictable. So, you know, the reason why a word comes into the language or an accent changes or people use those grammatical structures is it's random, it's chaotic, it can't be predicted. And so one theory was proposed by Charles Hockett. He said that errors occur in language, and we tend to pass these errors on to other users. That's why we've got that there. So O is next to P on the keyboard. Okay, so evidence to support this can be seen in technology where errors have been adopted as an acceptable feature. So the misspelling of owned as PWNED, it's a common term implying domination or humiliation of a rival among the online gaming community. And you'll get lots of other examples in that video that I showed on the previous slide. If you look at that birth of a nickname, take the word nickname itself. The original word was eke name, because eke means also, like an also name. But when you say that word and you put your indefinite article in front of it, you do an and, don't you? A nickname. Have you got a nickname like that? And so the N from the end of the indefinite article gets morphed onto the beginning of eke name, which starts with a vowel, and people say nickname now rather than the original eke name. Now that's an example of what Charles Hockett is talking about, where he says so-called errors, although that's a kind of prescriptive term, I suppose, but errors in language are passed on to others and then disseminated. Okay, so look at this horrible graph. So this is kind of like the counter argument. So this is to say, well, actually, lots of change, it's not driven by random chance. And actually, if it were just driven by chance, then you'd end up with a mess. You'd just end up with chaos like that. And instead, change tends to happen in a fairly organized, systematic kind of way, where a feature spreads through society, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly. Diffusion and S-curve. Here we go. So there's Gene Aitchison saying change. Well, it tends to start in a small way, and it affects a few words. Think, for example, about these Norman French words that are coming into the language in the early medieval period, or American forms, maybe, which are being used in global English. At first, there's a fluctuation between new forms and the old, like the two of them are concurrent. And gradually, the new forms oust the old. Okay, so when the innovation spread to a certain number of words, the change appears to take off and spreads rapidly in a relatively short time. So, and after a period of momentum, it's likely to slacken off. Yet changes do not, on the whole, happen in isolated bursts. One original change is likely to expand and spread to progressively more linguistic environments in a series of related changes. So here's an S-curve diagram, which is there. I've reproduced that faithfully from the textbook on page 221. And this is taken from Gene Aitchison's excellent book, Language Change, Progress or Decay. So there you've got language change features over here, and here we've got time, and we've got the spread of language change beginning slowly, and then that feature kind of takes off, and you've got a really quick rate of change that happens before then it slows and begins to stabilize. So that's an S-curve diagram. Hey, up, we've got more diagrams going here. So the S-curve model can also be applied to the overlapping change features, which Aitchison refers to, which suggests that larger scale changes can be smaller interrelated changes. Okay, so it's demonstrated here where you've got change features coming in through the language, and it's showing that, you know, the old form and the new form are happening concurrently. I mean, I'm thinking here about, you know, if you read your Shakespeare and you're looking at second person pronouns, you know, sometimes he's using thou quite consistently, sometimes he's using you quite consistently. He's on that cusp between, like, the disappearance of that second person pronoun thou, thee, and thy. It's kind of like disappearing from the language, but he's occasionally using it. Okay, and another example would be the construction of sentences. So if you read Shakespeare, sometimes he's constructing an interrogative like that. Thinkest thou, blah, blah, blah. And then at other times he's using the newer form with the dummy auxiliary verb, dost thou think? So that one illustrates the relatively new usage of the verb to do and the new kind of inverted sentence structure. And in time, that older form falls out of use. Okay, so I hope that's given you some kind of overview about why and how language changes. As always, a lot of the material that I'm talking through here, I'm depending upon the AQA textbook, particularly that last bit there, which is on page 221 to 222. And in our next videos, we're going to go global. Yes, we're going to take English abroad. I'm looking forward to it already.